Two balloons and a book. I think both balloons are pretty, eye-catching, pleasing. Think of what you would see at a birthday party. And think of a book, solid, large, something you would see in an old library or bookshop. The balloons are fragile, vulnerable. They go away. Their air escapes. They're exposed to a pin. The book is not so attractive, but does seem more permanent and more sturdy. I want you to think about something. Which one of these is closer to how you understand your life? Now, Solomon is going to set out on a quest, an investigation. He's going to see what living a certain way reveals. He's not doing it as an outside observer. He's doing it as a participant. We can kind of understand some of his reasoning here. If many of the pleasures that he's written about in the first part of chapter 1 are okay and fine and great, then why wouldn't I just have more of them? So Solomon does this and then reports on the results. He finds what we all know to be true, but often don't really believe. This search exposes a problem, a fault, an error in our thinking. So let's listen to the preacher as he explains to us what he did and what he discovered. So he's going to set out on a search, and he begins with, for all of us programmers, the search's parameters. Verses 12 through 18. Solomon's life goal had been to understand all that wisdom can discover. He plans then to apply that search to the satisfactions, to the pleasures, the joys of life. And that investigation has some clear parameters as he lays them out. First, to understand our times. Solomon limited himself to investigating and understanding within a human, time-bound, temporal framework. Verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And it is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun. Behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. For what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now, the key phrase is under the heaven and under the sun. Solomon is going to apply finite human wisdom to the meaning and the meaningfulness of life. And notice what he perceives. And frankly, he's not very hopeful. He has observed in the past how man's current lot is generally unhappy. This is what God has given. The unhappy work people must do has been given to them by God. He is once again looking back to the fall and the curse, pain in childbirth, deep troubles in marital relationships, and heavy, relentless, resisted toil to provide for family were the result of Adam's fall, and they are the common lot of all humans. But they were chosen as the consequence that God imposed on all humanity for all of this age under the sun. And as a result, he expects to find that all of man's efforts will therefore be pointless and fruitless. So he sets out on this search with his glass not half empty. I mean, it's turned upside down. And notice that he expresses this in a proverb. Sums it up in this proverb, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. He expects that all that he will observe is unchangeable and overwhelmingly lacking. What is the point in living in a world and a time when change cannot be changed? And he sets out to not only understand about our time, but to understand about wisdom and folly. Verses 16 to 18. Verse 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this also is but striving after wind. For in much wisdom is vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So don't go to school. Go what he perceives. First, Solomon is going to approach the investigation out of great personal experience. He is insisting that what he is about to preach is not the sad, disillusioned despair of a man at the end of life. Not at all. This was the intentional investigation carried out by a man known for his God-given wisdom, who had the means and wherewithal to execute his plan. He set his heart to experience, to understand, to explain what wisdom really is and what madness and folly really are. And paradoxically, he expects that this pursuit will itself be like chasing the wind. He will appear the fool as he stands at the courtyard of his life, waving in his arms and clenching his fist to grasp the fog and vapor of human wisdom, of human humor and folly. The word madness here probably refers to the lunacy, the incongruity, the oddness that makes things funny. You could almost use the word, as a couple of commentators suggest, comedy. I went to search out what it means to laugh. And what he expects and what he anticipates, he states once again in a proverb. And I think you're hearing some structure here, aren't you? What he expects, expressed in a proverb. What he expects, expressed in a proverb. Ever-increasing wisdom and knowledge bring ever-increasing vexation and sorrow. Why is this true? Well, because in this age we learn knowledge and understand wisdom more and more and more, with the effect, well, that we are more frustrated and discouraged by the tragic futility of it all. If it is merely a quest under the sun in this age, in which everything will end in a grave, what's the point? Solomon then is setting out on a journey. But his expectations to what he will find and what he will see are going to color all his results. First, he begins with the search in pleasure. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. So where would you begin to find the true meaningfulness of life? Listen to what he says. Verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. And behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it's mad, no pleasure. What use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, and my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of men to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom returned with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. For my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was the reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity, and a striving after the wind. There was nothing to be gained, under the sun. It was all bright, shiny balloons. Now notice, as he begins the search, there are some expected problems in verses 1 and 2. I love his self-talk here. It's almost as though he's trying to talk himself into enjoying the pleasures that he is sure will not please him in the long run. But he's got to do it anyway. I mean, what a hard thing. It seems that Solomon goes into it with his conclusion predetermined. He says, I made myself do these things in spite of the fact I knew that they were going to be empty and meaningless. So what do you think he will find? Well, exactly what he expects. And so there are the great pursuits in verses 3 through 11. There's some discussion about how many of these there are, but most of us can recognize these as common to our lots. There is a pursuit in wine. He is, as we should be too, careful with wine. I love what he says. And I use my wisdom here. He seeks to cheer his body, but not too much. It's wise to be sober, and drunkenness is a great folly. And I think that we could include food in this category as well. I know many Christians do not drink at all, and that's fine. But for those of us who do, let's pay close attention to Solomon's freedom and his caution. There's a pleasure in the food and drink under the sun, but there is also a kind of food and drink in God that satisfies. As one great feast, Jesus stands up and announces, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. As one writer said, quote, the preacher wants us to know that neither the connoisseur nor the drunkard can find true grain in the glass, end quote. Solomon was enormously rich, and he had great homes. With his great wealth, he was able to expand it on vast estates, palatial homes, elegant, expensive yards, ponds, swimming pools, gardens, groves. He surrounded himself with slaves and servants to cater to the needs and wants of guest and king. The desire to establish a Garden of Eden for ourselves is a deep inner desire, and having a lovely home and a great yard, and maybe next year something a little bigger, a little better, a little grander. Taking pleasure in our homes and families is not sinful. But you must not set your heart on it and get your identity from it. Why? It's going to crumble. It's going to fall, because there is coming one day an end. Well, he searches out great possessions. It's a great thing to be a wealthy king. Bought male and female slaves and slaves who were born in my house, 2 categories. He had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. He could gather and store and enjoy. He had more possessions than anyone, which kind of often the point. Our constant scrabbling for more is often a desire to have more than someone else. The pleasure of great possessions often is in being sure, that others know about it. Are great possessions sinful? Is there some sort of greater righteousness in being poor? It's not the thing itself. It's how you think about it. But then what is going to happen to all that wealth? What about your bank account? How quickly can it disappear? We put our belongings in a container. We had put all our belongings in a container to go to, and then loaded it once again to come back from journey. Everything we owned, except what fit in some suitcases and our backpacks. A single wave sweeping over the ship, carrying all our possessions, could have destroyed it all. Of course, coming back, it didn't help that they loaded it upside down on the ship, all the way from Germany, upside down. No amount of insurance can replace the irreplaceable. Jesus told us not to pile up where there is rust and decay. Instead, pile up in heaven. For only there it is truly safe. And he investigated the pleasures of sex. Multiplying concubines was not just a head count. He investigated the delight of men. Now look, many Christians are uncomfortable talking about this subject, and we should be discreet. But sex is one of the pleasures of life. Stop snickering, teenagers. As an expression of love and oneness in marriage, it is a great gift from God. It is also filled with many temptations and many troubles. The Bible has much to say about it that is beyond the scope of the preacher's words from this text. And suffice it to say that we must think of sex in the context of marriage as a good and wonderful thing. It is one of the pleasures that God gave and commended to us. And he evaluated what it meant to be of high position. He investigated and evaluated the pleasures of promotion. He thought about what it meant to not only be a king, but to be a really great king. As he grew in kingly stature, his wisdom did not leave. The little X means close. Who knew? So his wisdom expanded to fill the exalted position he held. We can recoil at that as being, prideful. No, we should not boast sinfully, but a wise man thinking about power and position saw pleasure in it. Well, he could have anything he desired. At the end of the day, he could have, and apparently did have, just whatever he wanted. It's like the amazingly rich people today who can and do have everything they want. They set the mind on something, they desire something, they procure it. This is material at its under the sun best. Now, what's the ultimate conclusion? While he was involved in all these things, he enjoyed it. Pleasure was real. And at some level, the pleasure was good. But it was in the moment, and thus the problem. But then he thought about it and realized that the work, the toil to gain was empty because nothing is ultimately gained. There may be pleasure in the moment, but there is nothing permanent about any of those things that brought him pleasure. You can hear the struggle, can't you? As one writer put it, quote, the preacher in Ecclesiastes is not the prodigal son that Jesus teaches us about. Though they both will come to similar conclusion, their motives and purposes are distinct. Prodigal gorges on pleasures because he believes it's his right. He sells what belongs to him in order to get women and drink and friends for happiness. The preacher, in contrast, seems to doubt whether this interior hole in his life can find anything to fill it. By wisdom, he tests his theories and weathers the truth of it. The prodigal consumes what is under the sun. The preacher contends with it. End quote. Well, he begins with a search for pleasure, but then he moves to a search for meaning, verses 12 through 23. If the pleasures of life cannot ultimately satisfy, what about purposes in life? Can we find meaning and purpose in this life that yields a sense, a lasting sense, even possibly, could it, an eternal sense of satisfaction and well-being? Well, he looks first, naturally, in the life of wisdom. He starts with what he knows well. And what he may have in mind here are more than wisdom. He's thinking in the broad intellectual pursuits, the life of the mind. Listen to what he writes. So I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly, for what can the man do who comes after the king? Well, only what had already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. What is that event? Death. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. So why have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart also that this is also vanity, for of the wise as of the fool there's no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies, just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun is grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the sun. Many of us know many people who would echo those last two sentences. Well, he starts off with his truth statement and all of his experience. Solomon has one absolute truth. Wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. Wisdom is better than folly. Duh. Light is better than darkness. Smart is better than stupid. But how many people consciously choose the dark, the foolish, the stupid? Probably the majority. Now, once again, we are given a proverb to reflect on. Solomon says, quote, the wise see, they have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. I love that. The contrast isn't a contrast, right? But it is. So the wise see because they have eyes, but the fool, even with his eyes, walks in darkness. Well, it leads to some obvious problems. The same fate befalls both the wise and the fool. All will die. Both the wise and the fool will return to the dust. Both will end in the grave. The fool's end seems right. But why should the wise end like this too? Even the perfect, the sinless man, wise beyond all measures, the greater Solomon, he died. Tragically, there's no enduring remembrance of the wise or of fools. Now, we might write about them. We might record their history. Some men's wisdom earns them a place in history. So what? Just like the fool, every one of them now, including this wise preacher, is now dead. What's the conclusion? I hated life. If you can see and do not understand that there is a greater difference between wisdom and folly than what is beyond the grave, this is terrible. Why would it matter? All is vanity, all is empty, all is passing useless. He is in fact standing out in his backyard trying to grab the wind. All his wisdom, his carefully worked out investigation, Solomon arrives at, well, a foolish conclusion. I hate life. Well, if not in the search for meaning in the life of wisdom, what about in the life of work? Preacher now turns to where many gain their identity, their significance, their satisfaction. Will your life's work bring you lasting joy? Verse 18, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise or fool? Yet he will be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity, so I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes the person who toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. Name, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, 2 kids who ripped his kingdom in half. This also is vanity and a great evil. What is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? All his days are full of sorrow, his work is vexation. And even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is emptiness. Now, let me pause here and remind you that Solomon is not merely focusing on vocation. He is highlighting all that we toil in and work for. Maybe a job, but it involves school and home and ministry. And there's a sad reality. He hated his life. Now he hates his toil. That's sad. What's he got left to love? He reflects on the work that brought all his gain, and he hates it. Why? Do we sometimes resonate with this? You see, he hates it because, as it relates to his possessions, he must leave all his possessions to those who are coming after him. Well, yes. And as it relates to my posterity, I don't know whether they will be wise or foolish. In Solomon's case, they were fools. And what is the conclusion? This is empty and temporary. This has no lasting value or worth. The sad reality is that when I leave this world, I leave my stuff to, well, you know. A sad result, gave up his heart to despair. Despair is a strong word. How does one go on with work when there is no apparent purpose, no lasting value? Why is there despair? Because all he had worked so hard for, he must leave for another to enjoy. Now wait, isn't that just self-centered? What's the conclusion? Human gains nothing from all their toil. Their days are full of pain at night. Their minds do not rest. The harder they work, the more they have, the less peace and secure they feel. This also is vain and empty. It's useless. Now, while this may be brutally real, is it the right way to respond? Even though there will be a sure and certain end to you and all you labor for, should we then hate our lives and hate our work? This is a really good question. What did the investigation produce? What did he discover? How do we think about this? Well, there's nothing better for a person, he says in verse 24, that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. Funny how we quote the first part of that sentence and don't quote the second part of that sentence. For apart from him, who can eat or who can drink enjoyment or have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after wind. So what's the conclusion? First, enjoying life is good. There's nothing better than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in our toil. In other words, there is a different way to think about the tragic reality in which we live. Just because everything comes to an end is no reason to despair, to hate life, to hate our work. Why? Because all that is good and enjoyable in life is from the hand of God. For the first time, Solomon evaluates what he has experienced in the light of God. We can enjoy these things not because they are valuable or lasting or permanent in and of themselves. We can enjoy the balloons, even if they are balloons. We can enjoy them as God's good gifts. The mundane and magnificent of life and living are all both from the hand of God. And a sudden and surprising reversal, the shining wisdom of a man under the sun breaks forth. The despair, futility, the hate for life all comes because we are evaluating them apart from God. None of what Solomon had investigated were sinful in and of themselves. Okay, we could argue about concubinage. But if we're pursuing them in the hope of lasting pleasure and limitless value, we will fail. Without God, without seeing all through His eyes, we cannot eat and have lasting enjoyment. And the second great insight is that God gives wisdom and joy to those who please Him. There's pleasure in the world under the sun, but it is ashes after the fire. When we know that it is from God and is pleasing to God, the fire is good and great and maybe even at times glorious, but the ashes are as sure as the fire. God has changed the way we think about it. What a moment to discover, to really understand. To the sinner, God gives the work of gathering, but God only gives the lasting fruit to those who please Him. But never forget, enjoying life is also fleeting. It's chasing after wind. It's a dainty, lovely, beautiful, fragile balloon. And because it is God's gift and because we please Him, that it will fade and that will eventually fail does not lead to despair or hatred. It is factoring the end into each present passing moment. Now, let's move towards the New Testament for a moment. Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Notice the way that's stated, the opposite from the way we usually interpret it. Do not work for food that perishes, Jesus says, but for the food that endures to eternal life. Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the Scriptures have said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now this He said about the Spirit, who those who believed in Him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. So what is this all about? God created the world in a paradise called the Garden of Eden. This was man's first place. And man sinned, and the world was cursed and would never be Eden until the end. God had designed the world for the curse, for finite and fallen humans, the world that we now live in. And we tend to want Eden recovered now. So we go about our pleasures, not to enjoy God, but to recreate what was lost. Many are the dreams of utopian paradises, but Eden is gone. No amount of trying will make it again. So enjoy what God has given you in a way that pleases Him while living in this now, this fallenness, this futility. We are brought to a difficult truth about God. This truth is where many struggle. God does not provide in His redemptive work an escape from the world in which we live. He provides a way to live in it. Two final words from a wise traveler and writer under the sun. Both of these are quotes. In Jesus, the true Solomon, son of David, we learn as His people to become tour guides and mall maps in the world. Here's where you are, we say by grace to those around us. Here is what things were once like, and here is what it is like in the world now, and here is the language you need wisely to get through this world with God. This is what we were meant for. Wherever there is, we have a God-given language for it. It's a voice, a language that we never expected God to give us, but He did. Erskine also wrote, no matter how called or wise he is, no matter how helpful and necessary his mentoring will prove to be for us, even a man of God still squints and sweats beneath the sun. To use even a man of God to accrue wisdom under the sun is a vanity. After all, Solomon died, and so will we. And even the very wise cannot fix the world. Only a death and a resurrection can. Grant, Father, that we will have great hope, not in this world, but in the world to come. That we in this world, in this age, under the sun, will believe your word and trust in you, and put our hope not in the passing riches of this world, which are sure to fail, but in the eternal riches, your grace and your great glory. Make it so in our hearts.